Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into a wealth of information to extract the essential, fascinating insights you need to be truly well-informed.
Glad to be diving in today.
So today we're tackling a topic that's quietly but profoundly reshaping economies worldwide: self-employment. And specifically, the often overlooked question of social protection. Think about it. The world of work is transforming at lightning speed. More and more people are choosing or, finding themselves pushed into carving their own paths as self-employed individuals.
Yeah, it's often championed, isn't it, as
Yeah.
the epitome of independence, innovation, maybe unparalleled flexibility.
Exactly. But what happens when that very independence, that entrepreneurial spirit, runs headfirst into the fundamental human need for basic social safety nets? For protection when life throws a curveball.
That's precisely the crucial question we're here to explore today. Because while the allure of self-employment is undeniably strong, it often comes with a set of, let's say, hidden vulnerabilities, things that traditional employment contracts inherently covered. So our mission today is really to dig into the most important nuggets of knowledge from recent research, helping you navigate the complex and, frankly, sometimes bewildering landscape of social rights for the self-employed across Europe.
Okay.
We'll try to uncover why this topic is rapidly moving to the forefront of the policy agenda, look at the surprising risks these workers actually face, and, maybe most fascinatingly, how their access to social protection varies so dramatically depending on the specific welfare regime a country operates under.
That's right. Whether you're already forging your own path as a freelancer or maybe a small business owner, perhaps you're considering making that leap. Or maybe you're just intensely curious about how different societies are grappling with these massive economic shifts. Regardless, this deep dive is designed to deliver those aha moments.
Oh, fully.
And provide you with a real shortcut to being well-informed about a topic that directly impacts millions and is, quite literally, shaping the very future of how we work and live.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this. Why are policymakers suddenly shining such a bright, urgent light on self-employment and its social safety net? What's driving this sudden focus?
Well, what's truly fascinating here is the speed at which this issue has gained prominence. Over just the past 5 years or so, the discourse around improving the social situation of the self-employed, we're talking working conditions and access to social protection, it's rapidly gained ground.
Right.
In EU circles, in domestic policy debates, and in scientific research, too. This isn't just an academic exercise anymore. It's really become a pressing political and social concern across the continent.
So it's moved from theory to practice, basically.
Pretty much. The European Union, for instance, has moved beyond just discussion to take very concrete initiatives.
Okay, when you say concrete initiatives, you're talking about real, tangible actions that directly influence policy, aren't you?
Well,
not just, theoretical papers.
Absolutely. Real, tangible actions with significant implications. A prime example is the European Commission's proposal for a council recommendation on access to social protection for both employees and self-employed workers.
Yes, I remember that.
This proposal, issued back in March 2018, wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It emerged after a complex two-stage consultation process involving various stakeholders.
Okay.
But what makes it particularly noteworthy and really underscores its significance is that it even faced considerable opposition from European employers' organizations.
Oh, really? Why?
While they initially resisted entering into negotiations with trade unions on this matter,
Yeah.
they saw it as potentially increasing their costs or regulatory burden.
Okay. Standard concerns.
Right. But the fact that the Commission pushed through with this proposal despite such powerful opposition speaks volumes, I think, about the growing recognition of this issue's urgency and its place on the political agenda.
Yeah, that does send a message.
It really signals a shift in perception, recognizing that the current social protection landscape for the self-employed is just, it's not sustainable.
That's a powerful signal indeed. It tells us this isn't merely a fleeting trend, but something with significant political will behind it, even with pushback. But what are the deeper underlying forces driving this surging interest? It can't just be a sudden epiphany among policymakers, surely.
No, you're right. It's far from a sudden epiphany. If we connect this to the bigger picture, these aren't isolated trends. They're interconnected forces fundamentally reshaping the very nature of work in Europe and, frankly, globally.
Like what specifically?
Well, a major catalyst has been the broader restructuring of economic and labor markets. This whole process was significantly accelerated and highlighted during recent economic crises, particularly the big one in 2008.
Ah, right, the financial crisis.
Exactly. Those crises exposed the vulnerabilities in traditional employment models and, critically, pushed more individuals towards self-employment. Often not out of pure entrepreneurial ambition, mind you, but sometimes out of sheer necessity as stable jobs became scarce.
And I imagine the meteoric rise of the platform economy, what many of us now instinctively call the gig economy, plays a colossal role here too. That's fundamentally altered how so many people work.
Precisely. The burgeoning importance of the platform economy is an undeniable key driver. It has introduced entirely new ways of working, think ride-sharing drivers, freelance designers on global platforms, delivery workers,
Sure.
all of which blurred the traditional lines between conventional employment and self-employment. This creates novel and complex challenges for social protection systems that were originally designed for a much more clear-cut binary world of work.
Yeah, systems built for factories, not apps.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And, furthermore, we've witnessed a significant sectoral shift. Self-employment has become widespread in sectors traditionally dominated by salaried workers.
Like where?
Consider construction, for instance, or logistics and transport areas where the independent contractor model has truly taken root. This wasn't historically the case for such a large proportion of the workforce in these sectors.
Right.
And it means that the self-employed are no longer just the traditional artisans or small shopkeepers we might picture.
So we're witnessing not just more people choosing self-employment perhaps, but also new forms of it emerging. And it's expanding into areas that used to be solely the domain of salaried work. That's a profound shift. But let's look at the numbers for a moment. Has the overall self-employment rate actually gone up across Europe, or is it more nuanced than that?
It's an interesting nuance, actually. While the total number of self-employed workers across the EU has remained relatively stable over the past decade, so the overall size of the self-employed workforce hasn't dramatically swelled,
Okay.
there's been a significant and consequential internal shift. What we've seen is a notable growth in the number of own-account self-employed individuals.
Own account, meaning?
These are individuals who work for themselves without employing anyone else, truly going it alone.
Okay. The freelancers, the solo operators.
Exactly. This segment has grown particularly rapidly since 2008, and they now constitute a substantial, I think it's 71.6% of all self-employed workers in the EU.
Wow, that's a commanding majority. So even if the overall pie isn't expanding much, the slices within it are changing dramatically. A much larger portion of people striking out entirely on their own, often without the safety net of even one employee.
That's exactly the insight. And it's worth noting that this upward trend in non-agricultural own-account self-employment, which rose from about 7.1% in 2002 to 9.0% in 2017, has actually been partially counterbalanced by the shrinking agricultural sector.
Right, farming.
Historically, agriculture employed around half of all self-employed workers, so its decline masks the significant growth of self-employment in other, often newer, sectors of the economy.
So the composition is definitely shifting, moving away from traditional, often intergenerational self-employment in farming towards more independent, non-employer self-employment in diverse and often novel sectors.
Precise.
That shift in composition makes perfect sense. But this brings us to the flip side of this shiny coin of independence, the hidden vulnerabilities that often come hand in hand with this shift. Here's where it gets really interesting, I think, as we explore the gray areas and, frankly, the unintended consequences of a flexible labor market pushed to its limits.
Indeed. And this is where it gets complicated. During the economic crises, with widespread unemployment, self-employment unfortunately became, to some extent, a tool for companies to gain a competitive advantage.
How so?
Well, sometimes by circumventing Social Security contributions and labor regulations, essentially pushing workers into a self-employed status, even when their working conditions mirror traditional employment.
Right, so saving costs.
Exactly. And this, in turn, had a detrimental effect. It weakened the tax base that traditionally finances standard employment Social Security systems and, consequently, the overall financing of social protection.
So companies were essentially pushing workers into self-employment to cut costs and avoid responsibilities, even if those workers weren't truly independent entrepreneurs. That sounds like a legal loophole exploited for economic gain.
You could certainly see it that way in some cases. This practice gave rise to what are now termed hybrid forms of employment.
Hybrid forms? Like what?
Well, one such form is dependent self-employment. This is where an individual is technically self-employed, but relies on one or a very few clients for most of their income. And crucially, they often receive direct guidelines on tasks, blurring the line with traditional employment. They lack true entrepreneurial autonomy.
Okay, so they look self-employed on paper, but act like an employee in practice.
Pretty much. And then there's the more problematic form, bogus self-employment.
Bogus.
Yeah.
Sounds dodgy.
It often is. This is a deliberate misclassification, where an employer treats a true employee as an independent contractor, specifically to avoid paying Social Security contributions, sick leave, holiday pay, or other employment rights.
Wow.
It's effectively hiding their true status as a wage employee to avoid responsibilities and costs. These hybrid forms pose significant challenges to national labor and social policies because the legal frameworks struggle to keep pace with these new realities.
I can imagine.
And this has led to an increased emphasis on what's sometimes called individualized activation.
What does that mean?
Well, this shift, while maybe ostensibly promoting autonomy, essentially pushes the burden of managing risks like sickness, unemployment, or even retirement entirely onto the self-employed individual, rather than having collective systems share that load.
So less collective safety net, more individual responsibility.
Exactly. It's a move away from collective solidarity towards individual responsibility for welfare.
That sounds like a recipe for precarious conditions, especially for those forced into such arrangements. Are there hard statistics to back up just how vulnerable these self-employed individuals might become?
There are, and the numbers are quite stark. Research conducted by Eurofound back in 2017 revealed that a striking 1 in 4 self-employed people interviewed across Europe were categorized as either vulnerable, that was 17%, or concealed self-employed, another 8%.
Concealed, like the bogus self-employment.
Largely, yes. And these aren't just abstract terms. These groups often find themselves trapped with precarious working conditions. They frequently became self-employed out of necessity, not necessarily choice or entrepreneurial drive.
Right.
And consequently, they have very little real autonomy or control over their work.
And what about the actual economic impact of that vulnerability on these individuals' lives? Does it translate into, well, poverty?
The economic impact is profound and deeply concerning. Consider this striking statistic. In 2015, the at-risk of poverty rate for self-employed workers was 3 times higher than that of salaried workers.
3 times higher.
3 times. Let that sink in for a moment. That statistic alone highlights a significant social challenge, revealing a large segment of the self-employed population living on the edge of financial insecurity.
That's huge.
It is. And this situation, maybe surprisingly, has historical echoes. It recalls the proletaroids in Germany during the 1920s.
Proletaroids. Never heard that term.
It was coined by a sociologist named Geiger. He used it to describe poor, vulnerable, self-employed people, like farmers and craftsmen back then, who lost their professional identity and economic stability as a result of new industrial development.
Wow. So a historical parallel to the disruption we see today.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder that the digital and platform economies, much like the Industrial Revolution before them, can create new forms of economic precarity for seemingly independent workers. They disrupt traditional livelihoods and can leave individuals exposed.
Wow. Proletaroids. That's a term that truly puts a historical mirror up to our current situation. What specifically can we learn from that past parallel about our present challenges?
Well, I think it shows us that economic shifts, whether they're industrial or digital, frequently create these new forms of vulnerability and challenge the existing social safety nets.
Right.
Just as the Industrial Revolution displaced traditional artisans and farmers, the modern gig economy is reshaping traditional employment, often leaving a new class of independent workers without the protections once taken for granted.
Yeah.
The historical parallel reminds us that this isn't necessarily a new problem of lazy or unambitious individuals, but often a systemic issue rooted in profound economic restructuring.
That's a powerful connection. And if people are aware of these risks, does it directly influence their career choices? Does it perhaps deter them from self-employment, even if they have a great entrepreneurial idea?
It absolutely does. A notable finding from the research is that about 9% of self-employed workers explicitly cite gaps in social welfare and social protection coverage as a main reason not to consider self-employment, or perhaps a reason to leave it.
Okay, so nearly 1 in 10.
Yes. This highlights a direct, tangible impact on career choices and potentially stifles entrepreneurial spirit among those who might otherwise contribute significantly to the economy, but simply feel they cannot afford to forego a basic safety net.
Yeah.
Which, raises an important question.
Mm-hmm.
How can we foster genuine entrepreneurial spirit and individual autonomy in our economies without inadvertently creating a new class of precarious workers who lack fundamental social security and are disproportionately exposed to life's risks?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you want to encourage innovation and independence. Those are economic drivers.
Sure.
But on the other, you simply cannot abandon people to the whims of the market without a safety net, especially when those whims can be so brutal. So let's dive into that safety net itself or the lack thereof. What's the general reality across Europe when it comes to social protection rights for the self-employed?
Well, the overarching reality is quite clear. While self-employed individuals are often implicitly or explicitly expected to organize their own working conditions and sort of solidarity mechanism.
Right, figure it out yourself.
Kind of. Their exclusion from the collective social protection system is much harder to justify from a societal perspective. European social protection systems, which largely developed around traditional employer relationships, are increasingly facing difficulties, both legally and de facto, in covering social risks for the self-employed.
So the systems just weren't built for them.
Essentially, yes. The general finding, almost universally across the board, is that the self-employed person usually has fewer rights with regard to social protection compared to salaried workers.
Yep.
It's a fundamental disparity built into the historical architecture of these systems.
And to be clear, when we're delving into this specific aspect for our deep dive, we're focusing on what's legally on the books, right? The statutory access, not necessarily all the practical hurdles someone might face trying to actually get benefits.
That's correct. This research specifically focuses on statutory access to social protection, what's legally enshrined and available by law in national legislation.
Okay. Why that focus?
Well, the choice is justified for two main reasons. First, statutory access is directly linked to fundamental social rights. So exclusion can therefore be seen as a denial of a basic entitlement.
Right.
And second, statutory access is relatively straightforward to assess and compare across multiple countries because it's legally codified. It allows for a clear overview.
But I imagine that what's written on paper isn't always what happens in practice. Are there other non-statutory challenges that often prevent self-employed individuals from actually receiving benefits, even if they're theoretically entitled on paper?
That's a very important point, and it definitely highlights the complexity beyond just the legal frameworks. While the study focuses on statutory access, yeah, we really need to remember that effective access, the actual ability to receive benefits when needed, can indeed be significantly hindered by a whole host of practical issues.
Like,
Well, for example, eligibility conditions are often still inherently tailored to salaried employment. That makes it difficult for self-employed individuals to meet criteria designed for a completely different work model.
okay.
There are also persistent issues of transferability of benefits between different schemes if a person moves between employment statuses, which happens a lot more now.
Right, moving between jobs and gigs.
Exactly. Furthermore, self-employed individuals might suffer from underinsurance, maybe due to very low minimum required incomes for contributions, or perhaps because they underreport their revenues,
Ah.
making their contributions too low to qualify for meaningful benefits down the line. So while the law might say one thing, the real-world hurdles can make that protection largely inaccessible or just inadequate.
So we have the legal framework, the statutory access we're focusing on, and then we have these practical realities that can create a very different experience for the self-employed.
Okay. But let's stick to the legal for a moment and look at the types of social protection schemes. There are two main categories here, correct? That's right. First, you have non-contributory schemes. These are typically tax-financed benefits. They're based on the principle of social citizenship, or social protection for all,
Meaning?
meaning they generally don't depend on your employment status or past contributions. If you're a citizen or legal resident, you qualify based on need or specific circumstances.
Okay, give me some examples.
Things like basic social assistance, certain universal family benefit schemes, and basic state-funded pensions that provide a kind of income floor in old age.
And the self-employed generally have access to these.
Yes, the good news here is that self-employed people typically do have statutory access to these foundational schemes in virtually all 35 European countries studied. This represents a significant baseline of universal support.
So the very basics of welfare are generally covered for everyone, regardless of their employment status. That's good to know. What about the other, perhaps more complex type of scheme?
The second, and often more challenging category, consists of insurance-based schemes. Now, these are benefits that are directly linked to gainful employment. They're typically financed through compulsory contributions from workers and other employers.
Okay, like national insurance or Social Security contributions.
Exactly. And access to these schemes is often significantly more difficult for the self-employed. In many countries, self-employed people are also subject to different, often stricter, eligibility conditions and potentially shorter periods of benefit receipt for these schemes.
Right.
And these insurance-based schemes can actually be further divided into two groups in terms of self-employed access, revealing some critical distinctions.
Okay, so within the insurance-based category, which ones are generally accessible to the self-employed, even if maybe with some difficulty?
Right. The first group comprises insurance-based schemes to which self-employed individuals generally do have statutory access, although there might be variations in specific rules or contribution levels.
Which ones are those?
These typically include things like healthcare insurance, invalidity benefits, old age pensions, and maternity benefits.
Okay, the big life risks.
Pretty much. These are areas where many systems have found ways to include the self-employed, recognizing their fundamental needs for health, long-term security, and support during family life, at least to some extent.
Okay, so a baseline of insurance for some major universal life events. But then there's a more problematic group, isn't there? The ones with the truly significant gaps.
Precisely. We refer to these as the three-gap schemes. These are benefits that have historically been strongly related to a specific salaried employment relationship,
Right.
and from which self-employed people have often been explicitly excluded, or to which they have only voluntary and often insufficient access.
Why the exclusion?
Well, for a combination of historical and economic reasons, reasons linked to traditional notions of employer responsibility and shared risk, these remain the most common areas of exclusion. They are, number one, sickness benefits, so coverage for income loss due to illness. Number two, unemployment benefits income support when work dries up.
Crucial.
And number three, occupational injuries and accidents at work benefits protection against injuries or illnesses sustained on the job.
Okay, so sickness, unemployment, work accidents. Those are the big three gaps.
That was the big three.
So what does this all mean when we put it together? It seems like there's a strong historical legacy protecting against some universal risks like basic healthcare or pensions, but leaving these gaping, often critical holes when it comes to things like losing work, getting sick, or being injured on the job as a self-employed person. It's a very different set of assumptions about who is responsible for these specific risks.
It absolutely is. The underlying assumption has traditionally been that the self-employed manage these particular risks themselves as part of their entrepreneurial venture,
Right, you're your own boss, it's your problem.
Kind of. Or that these risks are inherently linked to an employer-employee relationship where the employer bears some responsibility. This traditional design simply hasn't kept pace with the realities of the modern economy,
Yeah.
where self-employment is no longer just for independent professionals with high earning potential, but for a much broader, often more vulnerable segment of the workforce.
So the system hasn't caught up.
Exactly. The real takeaway here, I think, is a fundamental design flaw. Traditional safety nets simply weren't built for the dynamic and often precarious nature of self-employment, leaving these crucial holes for millions.
Given these pervasive gaps, how do different European countries actually classify in terms of providing statutory access to these crucial insurance-based schemes for the self-employed? Is there a clear pattern emerging from the research?
Yes, the study provides a very clear categorization. It classifies 35 European countries into three distinct clusters based on their statutory access to insurance-based schemes for the self-employed.
Okay. And what criteria does it use?
It uses two main criteria to make these distinctions.
Right.
First, whether coverage is compulsory for the self-employed, and second, whether individuals have the ability to voluntarily opt into a scheme if it's not compulsory.
Compulsory versus voluntary opt-in. Got it. Let's break down these clusters. What's the first group and what makes them stand out?
Okay, the first is Group 1, the Inclusive Systems Cluster. These are a small but significant group of 6 European countries. And here, self-employed people are required to be insured under all insurance-based schemes.
All of them. Mandatory.
All of them. Mandatory. This means they have comprehensive coverage, largely mirroring the social protection afforded to salaried employees. It represents the most robust and universal approach.
Which countries are these?
Examples in this cluster include Croatia, Hungary, Iceland, Luxembourg, Serbia, and Slovenia, What this really reveals is a profound commitment to decommodification, ensuring that even independent workers are significantly buffered from market whims through robust collective schemes.
Okay, very comprehensive. And then there's a middle ground, you said,
Right.
where there's some access, but perhaps more individual responsibility.
Exactly. That's Group 2, the Access à la carte systems cluster. This group comprises 10 countries. Here, self-employed people generally have access to all social protection schemes, but with specific arrangements that introduce more flexibility and, consequently, more individual choice and responsibility.
How does that work?
It means either voluntary affiliation to insurance-based schemes, so they're not required to be insured under all schemes like salaried employees, but they have the option to opt in,
Okay.
or they have access to a means-tested equivalent benefit if the insurance-based version isn't available.
So options, but you have to choose them or qualify based on low income.
Pretty much. Countries in this group include Austria, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Spain, and Sweden. It offers more flexibility, sure, but it also places a greater burden on the individual to understand and act on their social security needs.
Right, you have to know what you're doing. And the third group, the one that sounds the most concerning, where the gaps are most pronounced.
That's Group 3, the Exclusive Systems Cluster. And this is the largest group, unfortunately encompassing no less than 19 countries.
19. Wow.
Yeah. In these nations, self-employed people are not covered by one or more insurance-based schemes that are mandatory for salaried employees, nor can they even opt into these schemes voluntarily.
So no compulsory coverage and no option to join for certain things.
Exactly. Now, as with Group 2, the self-employed person might, in some cases, have access to a means-tested equivalent benefit, but the core insurance-based scheme itself is simply not available to them.
Which countries fall into this large group?
It includes places like Belgium, Bulgaria, Switzerland, Cyprus, Germany, Greece, France, Ireland, Italy, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Latvia, Northern Macedonia, Malta, Norway, Netherlands, Slovakia, Turkey, and the United Kingdom.
That's a huge chunk of Europe.
It is. And what this really reveals is a profound struggle across nearly half of Europe to adapt traditional welfare models to modern work. It's creating a kind of silent crisis for millions of independent workers who are left exposed to significant risks.
That's a significant number of countries where self-employed people face serious and systemic gaps in their social safety net. Okay, so this brings us to a deeper level of analysis. Why do these massive differences exist? Is it just random variation, or are there underlying historical and political patterns at play that shape these distinctions?
This is where we delve into the concept of welfare regimes, which is absolutely fascinating because it helps us understand the fundamental differences in how countries approach social protection.
Welfare regimes,
So-
like different models of capitalism.
Sort of, yeah. But specifically focused on the welfare state. What's truly insightful here is how the historical blueprints of a nation's welfare system continue to dictate the social safety net for its modern workforce, even the self-employed.
Like historical inertia.
Exactly. A key finding of existing studies is the crucial role of welfare regime path dependency. Think of it like this. It's how the original architectural blueprint of a city fundamentally dictates how new buildings can be added. Old rules, even if they're outdated, still shape today's possibilities.
Okay.
Countries facing similar challenges actually provide very different responses because of their embedded historical institutional patterns, rather than simply adopting what might seem like the most efficient or equitable solution today.
So it's not just about what a country wants to do now, but what its historical DNA for social protection has been for decades, maybe even centuries. That's a powerful constraint.
Exactly. Traditional typologies of welfare regimes, like Esping-Anderson's seminal model, they're largely based on criteria developed with salaried workers in mind.
Right.
Things like the generosity of social rights, the degree of social stratification embedded in the system, the balance between public and private provision. Our deep dive aims to explore how these traditional patterns hold up, or maybe don't, for the self-employed. It's about how decommodification, which is basically the extent to which a person can maintain a livelihood independently of the market.
How buffered you are from market shocks.
Precisely. How that plays out for this particular group, especially when those systems were never really designed with them in mind in the first place.
Okay, let's walk through some of these regimes. Let's start with the liberal regime, typically seen in countries like Ireland and the United Kingdom. What characterizes them in terms of their overall welfare state, and how does that philosophy translate to their treatment of the self-employed?
Right. In the liberal regime, Countries like Ireland and the UK, paradoxically, have among the highest rates of self-employment in the EU 28. Ireland was around 15%, the UK around 14% back in 2016.
Interesting. High self-employment, but a liberal welfare state.
Yeah. And importantly, there's been an ongoing increase in own-account self-employed individuals within these countries, reinforcing this trend. Now, these regimes are characterized by what's called a residual welfare state,
Residual meaning.
meaning they provide modest and often means-tested benefits, subject to strict eligibility requirements, and largely tax-financed. The state provision is generally limited to covering social risks through needs-based social assistance. Essentially, it acts as a last resort,
Okay.
thereby actively fostering private welfare arrangements, private pensions, private health insurance as the primary safety net.
So a very minimal state safety net, and the individual is largely expected to fend for themselves or rely on private insurance solutions. How does that philosophical approach translate to social protection for the self-employed specifically?
Well, for the self-employed, the logic of relying on means-tested benefits is even more pronounced. While salaried workers might be covered by some form of social insurance for certain risks, the self-employed often find their primary recourse is means-tested social assistance.
So they have to prove poverty to get help.
Generally, yes. This assistance is typically linked to those benefits, meaning you have to prove you have very little income or assets to qualify. This inherently explains the differing access.
Okay. What about specific gaps?
Specifically, in both Ireland and the UK, self-employed individuals have no access to comprehensive work injury schemes, which are typically non-contributory and non-means-tested for salaried workers.
Right.
They're also not eligible for contributory unemployment benefits, the kind that most employees contribute to and receive if laid off.
So if your contracts dry up, you're on your own unless you're destitute.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
While they can, in dire circumstances, qualify for non-contributory, means-tested unemployment benefits, it's a far cry from the robust support available to their employed counterparts.
So in the liberal model, it's very much about a basic, bare-bones safety net. And if you're self-employed, that net is often even more threadbare with significant holes. They fall squarely into that exclusive systems cluster we talked about earlier, right? Cluster 3.
They do indeed. Both Ireland and the UK are firmly in the exclusive systems cluster when it comes to access to insurance-based schemes, reflecting those significant gaps.
Okay. Any changes happening there?
Well, it's worth noting that even in these traditionally minimal systems, some reforms have been taking place, perhaps driven by the increasing numbers and vocal needs of the self-employed.
Like what?
In the UK, for example, a new single-tier state pension became available to the self-employed as of 2017, which was a notable step forward in simplifying things.
Okay.
And in Ireland, invalidity pensions and treatment benefit, which covers certain healthcare costs, were extended to self-employed people, also as of 2017. So while the core residual nature remains, there's maybe a slow, incremental movement towards addressing some of the most glaring vulnerabilities.
Okay, slow progress perhaps. Now let's shift gears to the corporatist welfare regimes. These include countries like Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. What's their foundational approach to social protection, and how does that influence their treatment of self-employment?
Right, the corporatist model. In these countries, the percentage of self-employed people in the workforce actually varies considerably. Most are below the EU 28 average, for example. Germany and Luxembourg are around 9%, France, Austria, Switzerland around 11%, Belgium at 13.5%.
Okay.
The Netherlands is an interesting exception. They saw a considerable increase to 15.3% in 2015, which even led to a specific recommendation from the Council of the EU about their self-employment social protection.
So the EU flagged it as an issue there specifically.
Yes. In general, these corporatist regimes base social protection on social insurance, offering typically a high degree of protection through occupational, corporatist-driven solidarity among salaried workers, meaning benefits are often tied to contributions made through employment, and systems can be quite fragmented by different professional groups or industries.
Okay. So a system built on strong links between employment and social benefits, often tied to specific professions or industries like, say, miners having a different pension scheme than teachers, that kind of thing.
Exactly that kind of thing.
How did that historically evolve for the self-employed then? They don't fit neatly into an employer-employee box?
Right. Social protection for the self-employed in these countries emerged much more gradually, often trailing behind the provisions for salaried workers, but generally following the same corporatist pattern.
So, segmented by profession.
Exactly. It means it's often highly differentiated by types of profession and historical traditions, much like the old guilds that once governed trades. It's often described as a categorical system,
Categorical.
meaning access is not uniform. Instead, the benefits you get might depend entirely on which specific box your self-employment falls into. This leads to complex and fragmented schemes, quite unlike a universal system.
Right, so like the French system you hear about being very complex.
That's a prime example. Think of the complex pension system in Germany, or the very category-based Social Security schemes in France, where access to benefits varies widely if you're a liberal professional, a craftsperson, or a farmer. Historically, reform trends have aimed towards inclusion and harmonization, but it's often been a kind of slow, piecemeal catch-up process.
And how do they fare with those three gap schemes we identified earlier: sickness, unemployment, and occupational injuries? Given the generally high level of protection for salaried workers in these systems, one might expect better coverage here for the self-employed too.
It's a key area where the limitations of the corporatist model for the self-employed become really evident. Similar to the liberal regime, access to these three gap schemes has been quite limited for the self-employed. These corporatist countries are mainly concentrated in that exclusive systems cluster, cluster 3, meaning significant exclusions persist.
Mostly exclusive. Are there
Uh,
exceptions?
Yes, there are some important nuances and exceptions within this group. Luxembourg is a truly unique case. It's the only corporatist country where self-employed people are compulsorily included in all schemes.
Really? So they buck the trend.
Completely. It places Luxembourg firmly in the inclusive systems cluster, Group 1. It essentially treats self-employed status almost identically to salaried employment for social protection purposes.
That's fascinating. It shows it's possible even within that regime type. What about some other prominent examples within this corporatist group, like Austria?
Austria, for instance, has gradually included self-employed people in its social protection system, giving them access to almost all schemes. While they are not compulsorily insured against unemployment, crucially, they can opt in, a significant change implemented back in 2009.
Okay, so an option for unemployment.
Yes. However, there's still notable differentiation between categories of self-employment, and possibilities exist to opt out if earnings fall below a certain threshold.
Yeah.
Belgium has undergone a long harmonization process, bringing self-employed individuals into compulsory state insurance for most social risks, but they are still explicitly excluded from unemployment and occupational sickness and injury protection.
Still, those gaps remain, even after harmonization.
Yes, the system still implicitly assumes these are risks best managed by the individual entrepreneur, perhaps.
And France and Germany, often seen as the quintessential corporatist states. How do they handle it? It sounds complex.
It is. The case of France is particularly intricate and really exemplifies the categorical system challenge. Social protection for the self-employed is highly fragmented with different schemes for different professional categories.
Right.
This means, for example, that some self-employment categories aren't eligible for certain benefits at all. And only farmers, for instance, might be eligible for comprehensive accident at work and injury benefits. Generally, self-employed workers in France have no access to unemployment benefits.
No unemployment cover.
Right. While efforts have recently been made towards standardization and simplifying the system, the fragmentation and gaps remain significant. Germany is quite similar to France in its approach. Different categories of self-employed have different scheme access, or their access is optional. For pensions, some self-employed categories may only opt in via voluntary funded schemes, often private. And critically, much like in France, self-employed people in Germany are also explicitly excluded from unemployment benefits.
So even with high protection for salaried workers, there are these significant holes for the self-employed in the core corporatist countries.
That's right.
And what about the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, which you also mentioned in this corporatist group? Do they follow similar patterns? Are they even more exclusive?
Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and the Netherlands are actually among the corporatist countries where the self-employed have the least access to comprehensive social protection. The Netherlands is a particularly interesting and somewhat debated case. It's sometimes classified as a mix of different regimes.
Okay.
However, unlike liberal regimes that primarily promote private arrangements, the Netherlands has tried to maintain an insurance-based system. Even so, for the self-employed in the Netherlands, sickness, invalidity, occupational disease, and work injury schemes are optional.
Optional, meaning you have to actively choose and pay.
Exactly. You must actively choose and pay into them. And crucially, unemployment benefits are not available at all. Switzerland similarly excludes the self-employed from sickness benefit, unemployment, and occupational injury benefits. Liechtenstein excludes them from unemployment and occupational injury benefits. It truly illustrates the enduring power of historical institutions, doesn't it? Systems designed around specific professions and traditional employer-employee relationships often struggle immensely to accommodate the fluid, diverse, and modern self-employed workforce, leading to these persistent and often problematic gaps.
That's a powerful observation. It really shows how historical context, even with varying rates of self-employment, can create these deep-seated, persistent gaps. Okay, let's move to the social democratic regime. This includes countries like Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. These are often seen as models of universal solidarity and comprehensive welfare states. How do they handle self-employment and social protection?
Right, the Nordic model, broadly speaking. In these countries, the welfare regime is based on a foundational principle of universal solidarity. The aim is providing high levels of social protection to all citizens.
Universalism is key.
Exactly. Benefits are often financed by general taxation, making them accessible regardless of employment history or contributions. Now, unlike the previous two regimes, the self-employed person in these countries is generally required to be covered by most of the same social protection schemes as salaried employees, or they have the choice to opt in with very favorable terms.
So, much more inclusive by design.
Yes. It reflects a deep commitment to comprehensive, wide-ranging benefits that are universal and offer equal access regardless of labor market status. And these robust social safety nets are also often combined with active labor market measures, retraining, job placement assistance, that sort of thing.
That sounds like a truly inclusive approach. And what about their self-employment rates? Are they also high, like in the liberal regimes, or does this comprehensive safety net influence how many people choose to be self-employed?
That's a perceptive question, and it reveals another fascinating aspect of this regime. Actually, these countries tend to have among the lowest rates of self-employment in Europe.
Oh, interesting. Lower rates.
Yes. For instance, Norway was at 6.2%, Denmark at 7.7%, and Sweden at 8.7% in 2016. Alongside a historical commitment to full employment, this low rate might be partly due to the widespread availability of flexible labor market arrangements for salaried employees.
So flexicurity, perhaps?
You could say that. It means there might be less perceived need or incentive for employers to engage in practices like bogus self-employment to cut costs, because the standard employment framework already offers a good degree of flexibility while maintaining employee protections.
So if you can get flexibility as an employee with protections, there's less pressure to become a precarious self-employed worker. That's a fascinating link, almost a virtuous cycle.
It could be interpreted that way, yes.
And do they manage to avoid those three gap schemes for the self-employed that are so problematic elsewhere? Sickness, unemployment, work accidents?
Largely, yes. This is where their universal approach truly shines. Self-employed people in Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden can access virtually all insurance-based benefits. There are almost no gap schemes in this regime,
Almost none. Any exceptions?
with the notable exception of Norway. Currently, self-employed people there are excluded from access to unemployment benefits.
Norway's the outlier there on unemployment.
Yes. So in terms of our clusters, Iceland stands out as part of the inclusive systems, Group 1, due to its comprehensive mandatory coverage. Denmark, Finland, and Sweden are in the access a la carte systems. Group 2, as self-employed often have strong voluntary opt-in options or universally available benefits. Norway, with its unemployment exclusion, is the outlier here, fitting into the exclusive systems Group 3 for that particular gap.
Okay. It seems like in these countries, the idea of universal protection genuinely extends to almost everyone, actively trying to ensure a robust safety net for all citizens, regardless of their specific employment contract. But you mentioned Iceland has higher self-employment rates despite being in the social democratic group. That seems like a unique nuance. Why is that?
It is a good observation, and it's true. Iceland's self-employment rate was notably higher at 11.2% compared to its Nordic peers. This is largely attributed to its specific economic structure, which is a higher proportion of small businesses and self-sustaining industries, like fishing and tourism.
Okay, economic structure.
And perhaps also a cultural ethos that, as one researcher put it, extols a strong work ethic, a strong ethos of self-help or self-reliance.
A bit more individualistic, maybe.
Perhaps. It resonates a bit with American individualism, despite being embedded within a fundamentally social democratic welfare state framework. So while the system is designed to be inclusive, cultural and economic factors can still significantly influence the prevalence of self-employment. It's never just one factor driving these
Yeah.
things.
That's a great example of how the specific context of a country can create interesting variations, even within a broader welfare regime. Okay, let's move south. The Southern European regime, encompassing countries like Cyprus, Greece, Italy, Malta, Portugal, Spain, and Turkey. What are the defining characteristics of their social protection systems, and how do they impact the self-employed?
Right, the Southern European model. In these 7 countries, social protection systems are generally seen as corporatist and fragmented, often creating a rather stark divide between well-protected insiders,
Insiders being.
typically those in stable, traditional employment, especially in the public sector, and then the outsiders with serious gaps in their coverage, which often includes the self-employed and those in precarious work.
Okay, a big divide.
A very significant characteristic of this regime, stemming from historical and cultural factors, is the strong state endorsement of the family as a main element in welfare provision.
The family as a safety net.
Exactly. The family unit often complements or even substitutes for formal state benefits, acting as a crucial informal safety net. This is often seen alongside the persistence of clientelism in social service provision sometimes.
And self-employment rates.
These countries generally have high rates of self-employment. Greece reached a striking 30% at one point, Italy 22%, Spain 16%. These high rates are largely explained by later industrialization.
How does that connect?
Well, later industrialization meant less development of large-scale industries compared to Northern Europe, and a continued significant weight of small and micro businesses in their economies. Self-employment was just more embedded.
So, a strong role for the family unit in welfare provision and a historical reliance on small businesses rather than large industrial employers. How does that translate to social protection for the self-employed, particularly in contrast to the corporatist model we discussed earlier?
Well, as most schemes are still largely occupation-related, this regime shares some similarities with the corporatist model. But the differentiation between categories of self-employment is often even more pronounced and can result in greater inequalities.
Even more fragmented than the corporatist model.
Often, yes. You'll find markedly different and unequal schemes for private sector employees, civil servants, and various very specific groups of self-employed. This characteristic is maybe most evident in countries like Greece and Italy.
For example,
In Greece, independent liberal professions, freelancers, and farmers have historically been insured in different social insurance funds depending on their profession. This leads to highly specific, often disparate coverage and significant gaps in provision depending on your exact classification.
wow.
In Italy, there are striking regulatory differences between as many as 4 main occupational groups of self-employed people regarding their access to various benefits. It creates an incredibly complex and often unfair patchwork of rights.
That sounds incredibly complex to navigate, almost like a labyrinth for someone trying to figure out their rights. And how do they fare with those critical 3 gaps schemes: sickness, unemployment, and occupational injuries? Worse than the corporatists.
Generally, yes. Self-employed workers in Southern European countries typically have even less access to the 3-gap schemes than in corporatist countries, which, as we saw, wasn't great to begin with.
Oof.
They're most often explicitly excluded from unemployment benefits, accident at work benefits, and occupational injury benefits. For example, in Italy, while some dependent self-employed persons and liberal professions are now required to be covered for certain risks, many self-employed workers still have no access to general unemployment protection.
Okay.
Similarly, in Cyprus, Malta, and Turkey, self-employed individuals generally have no access to unemployment protection at all. This really highlights how deep-seated cultural and historical factors, like the traditional role of the family as a safety net, can profoundly influence the design and, more importantly, the gaps in formal social protection.
That's a crucial point about the deep-seated cultural factors potentially slowing down formal provision. Are there any notable exceptions or recent changes within this Southern European regime that indicate a shift towards greater inclusion? Are they adapting?
Yes, absolutely. There have been some significant and interesting reforms showing dynamic adaptation even within historically constrained systems. Spain, for instance, has undergone major institutional changes regarding self-employment.
How so?
Their social protection system has been converging with that of salaried employment since about 2007. They've even recognized a new legal category, economically dependent self-employed trade workers, who now have specific Social Security rights, acknowledging that gray area.
Right, recognizing dependent self-employment legally.
Exactly. And crucially, unemployment insurance has been extended to self-employed people in Spain, 2010, Greece in 2011, and Portugal in 2013. That's a huge step.
That is huge, tackling one of the major gaps.
It is. Spain's self-employed work statute represents a concerted effort to apply similar social protection legislation to employed and self-employed workers, a significant step towards harmonization.
Okay. What about work accidents?
In terms of work accident coverage, self-employed workers now have compulsory or voluntary access to accident at work protection in Greece, Italy, Malta, Portugal, and Turkey. Though, again, often with specific exclusions, like for liberal professions in Greece, or maybe only voluntary access in Spain, except for their specific dependent self-employed category.
So progress, but still complicated and piecemeal.
Yes. These reforms suggest a growing recognition of the self-employed's vulnerabilities and a policy push to bridge some of the most critical gaps, albeit often in that characteristic fragmented fashion.
That's a crucial point, the dynamic nature of these systems adapting, even if slowly and unevenly. Okay, finally, let's look at the Central and Eastern European, or CEE, countries. This group includes Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Croatia, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Northern Macedonia, Poland, Romania, Serbia, and Slovakia. How do they fit into these established welfare regime typologies given their unique historical trajectory post-communism?
This group is particularly interesting because, academically, it's noted for not fitting neatly into a distinct, firmly consolidated welfare regime typology in the same way the others do.
They don't fit the boxes.
Not easily. They share a common communist past and patterns of economic and political transition which have led to constant reforms. These reforms have been influenced by both external actors, like the World Bank and IMF, and their unique national traditions.
Right, the transition years.
Exactly. They're often referred to as emergency welfare states, precisely because their systems are characterized by highly inventive, sometimes improvisational, combinations of old communist-era programs and newly adopted market-oriented reforms. Despite various attempts at classification, a single, firmly consolidated CEE welfare regime hasn't really emerged yet.
So a shared history of communism and transition, but a complex, evolving present with no single, clear model. What does self-employment look like in these countries? Was it even a thing before 1989?
Not really, not on a large scale. Self-employment is a relatively new and dynamic feature in these labor markets since the fall of communism. It was driven largely by the spontaneous eruption of micro-enterprises and small businesses, often following periods of high unemployment during the transition from centrally planned economies to market economies.
So it grew out of necessity again.
To a large extent, yes. These countries generally have a high share of self-employment now. For example, Poland, Northern Macedonia, and Romania show around 18% of their workforce as self-employed, indicating a significant reliance on independent work. In some cases, self-employment has grown much faster than traditional employment, reflecting that rapid economic restructuring.
Okay. And their approach to social protection for the self-employed, is it as varied as their overall welfare regime classification, or are there common patterns despite the lack of a consolidated regime type?
Protection does vary, but there are clear common patterns that distinguish them. Generally, these countries provide access to most insurance-based schemes,
Okay, that sounds promising.
except for usually unemployment benefit.
There it is again, the unemployment gap.
It remains a persistent and widespread gap in many CEE countries, too. Another common pattern is the possibility for self-employed individuals to opt into some schemes, most often sickness and maternity, indicating a degree of flexibility and individual responsibility.
Opt-ins like in the a la carte systems.
Somewhat similar, yes. There are also frequent exemptions from mandatory insurance in certain cases, particularly for low-income, self-employed individuals. But a key distinction from the corporatist and southern regimes is that CEE countries generally do not have categorical social protection based on different types or subgroups of self-employment.
So it's more uniform for all self-employed people within a country.
Generally, yes. The system is typically more uniform across self-employed individuals, unlike the fragmented professional categories you see in France or Greece, for instance.
Okay, so despite their unique history of transition, many of them still struggle with those persistent gaps, particularly unemployment. How do they align with our three clusters then? Is it a total mix?
It's truly a mixed picture in terms of our clusters, reflecting their diverse approaches. Croatia, Hungary, Slovenia, and Serbia, for example, actually fall into the inclusive systems cluster, Group 1.
Really? Fully inclusive?
Yes, meaning self-employed workers there are generally required to be covered by all social insurance schemes, which is a significant achievement post-transition. The Czech Republic, Estonia, Poland, and Romania are in the access a la carte systems, Group 2. offering options for voluntary affiliation or means-tested equivalents.
Okay.
However, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, Northern Macedonia, and Slovakia are in the exclusive systems, Group 3, where self-employed workers are not covered by or cannot opt into one or more essential insurance-based schemes.
A real spread across all three types.
Definitely. And it's also notable that unlike some Southern European countries that have made significant recent strides on unemployment, for instance, these CE countries have generally not implemented significant changes regarding self-employed social protection over the past couple of decades. The systems have been somewhat static in this area.
Interesting. So less refrain momentum there.
It seems so. What's truly fascinating here is how a shared communist past, despite reforms and differing approaches to market economies, continues to shape these very unique and often incomplete approaches to social protection, creating a dynamic but sometimes stagnant landscape for the self-employed.
That was a truly comprehensive look at the different European welfare regimes and how they grapple with the complexities of self-employment. It's clear there's no single solution, no one-size-fits-all. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are the common threads we can pull from all this? What are the broader implications for the future of work?
Well, I think a striking and rather sobering conclusion from the study is the pervasive nature of those three gap schemes. Remember, unemployment, accidents at work, occupational injuries, and sickness benefits.
Yeah, they kept cropping up.
They really did. These represent a clear, almost universal pattern of problematic access for the self-employed across many social protection systems, regardless of the welfare regime.
Regardless of the regime type, mostly.
Mostly. The social democratic regime, particularly Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden, stands out as the notable exception, demonstrating that it is indeed possible to achieve broad and inclusive coverage for these risks.
Okay.
But the prevalence of these gaps elsewhere points to what I mentioned earlier, a fundamental design flaw in traditional social safety nets. They simply weren't built for the dynamic, often precarious, and increasingly diverse nature of modern self-employment. They were designed for a different era, with different assumptions about who works and how.
So it's not just an isolated issue in one type of country, but a systemic challenge rooted in the very architecture of these systems. And what about the idea of decommodification for the self-employed that buffer against market forces? Has that evolved sufficiently? Is it getting better or worse?
It's complicated. While a certain dependence on the market might seem inherent to self-employment status, it's increasingly clear that policy choices have profound consequences. We're seeing a bit of a paradox. Well, measures are increasingly being taken to foster self-employment, for example, encouraging unemployed individuals to start their own ventures as a pathway back to work.
Right, active labor market policies.
Exactly. But this policy push, coupled with the unstoppable rise of the platform economy, can inadvertently leave more and more workers without adequate social protection, pushing them further towards market precarity.
So promoting it without protecting it enough.
That's the risk. Decommodification, the extent to which a person can maintain a livelihood and dignity independently of the market's whims, has been a long and uneven process for self-employed individuals. It varies not just dramatically across countries and welfare regimes, but even within different categories of self-employment in the same country, creating significant internal inequalities.
So we're actively promoting self-employment as an economic solution sometimes, but we're not necessarily providing the robust safety net that traditional employment often offered. What does this call for in terms of policy and future action? Where do we go from here?
Well, it clearly stresses the urgent need for concerted efforts towards better and more comprehensive inclusion in the social protection system for these fragmented and often vulnerable statuses that have emerged.
Inclusion seems key.
Absolutely. Policies designed to foster self-employment should absolutely go hand in hand with processes to remedy the negative outcomes of previous measures that may have deregulated labor law and actively fostered self-employment without adequate social safety nets in place.
So think about the safety net before you push people into self-employment.
Ideally, yes. It requires a holistic, integrated approach to ensure that as the world of work evolves and new forms of employment become dominant, social protection systems evolve with them, rather than lagging critically behind. We really need to rethink the very fundamentals of who is protected and how, moving beyond rigid, outdated definitions.
So what does this all mean for us, the listeners, and for the future of work in Europe and beyond? We've delved into the growing prominence and hidden vulnerabilities of self-employment, identified the specific persistent gaps in social protection, and seen how historical welfare regime models profoundly shape access to benefits across the European landscape. It's a complex picture.
It is. And this deep dive truly raises an important question, I think,
Huh.
about whether our traditional definitions of employment and protection are still fit for purpose in the 21st century. Are we inadvertently building a future of work where innovation comes at the cost of basic human security for a growing number of people?
Exactly. As the global economy continues to embrace flexible work and new forms of self-employment, how do you think societies can effectively balance the undeniable desire for individual autonomy and entrepreneurial drive with the fundamental need for universal social protection for all workers? What does a truly modern, inclusive social safety net look like in a world where jobs for life are increasingly rare and independence often means isolation from traditional protections?
Yeah, it's the big question.
Something to think about long after this deep dive ends.